We're very pleased to have Ed Garcia of the Philippines with us today. Ed has dedicated his entire life to the pursuit of peace, justice, human rights, and democracy. He's been a teacher, a nonviolence advocate, and social movement leader, a member of the 1987 Philippines Constitutional Commission, a human rights activist and researcher with Amnesty International, and for the last 20 years, a peace worker, mediator, negotiator, and peacebuilding advisor. He's done all this work around the world in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, so is eminently well qualified for a discussion today about the future of democracy in the Philippines. Ed's life has been marked by a radical commitment to the poor, the weakest and most vulnerable. He's always been an advocate for public participation in decision-making processes and has been a tireless worker for the institutional inclusion of all those who, through no fault of their own, have been excluded from normal social and political life. So Ed, welcome to the Toda Peace Institute's Public Conversations. We're joined in this discussion today by Olivia Stokes Dreier, who is our Senior Research Fellow in charge of Global Challenges Democracy Program. To get the ball rolling, I'd like to give you a chance to reflect on some of the key people and organizations in your life who are responsible for sharpening your political consciousness, your commitment to human rights, and the defense of Philippine democracy and democracy all around the world.
Well, to answer your question, Kevin, eons ago, when I graduated from high school, I still recall my father. He was a medical doctor. And he was Secretary of Health in the Philippines, and he brought me to all the far-flung areas, the barrios, where rural health units were being organized. And I saw for myself how there was such disparity, inequality, and poverty in the Philippines. So in a way, it was my father who was my first introduction to the harsh social reality which we lived through in the Philippines. So that was my very first introduction. Then, of course, I owe a lot to the Jesuit mentors who showed me the importance of being a man for others. And then my Latin American studies, especially my professor, Gustavo Gutierrez, who wrote the groundbreaking work, Liberation Theology in Peru. So the Latin American experience was also very important in my formation. Then I worked with Amnesty International in London at the International Secretariat, where I met some wonderful people, including Martin Ennals. Martin Ennals was an eminent Secretary General of Amnesty International, and later on he was the founding Secretary General of International Alert. So that was another experience of mine. And of course, International Alert taught me the importance of remembering always that peacemaking requires a marathon mentality. And of course, you were one of my inspirations as our Secretary General during that period when I worked with Amnesty. And what I cannot forget, obviously, are the walks we had around London where we exchanged ideas. So I want to say thank you publicly for all the lessons I learned through those conversations. And then finally, when I came back to the Philippines, as soon as I arrived, I was charged with sedition. And Pepe Diokno invited me to his home and said, we will quash this case. And then soon after, we organized a movement called Kaakbay, which means companion. And Jose Diokno was perhaps one of the most courageous statesmen the country ever produced. And he was also another great influence in my life. So in a sense, I gave you, in a nutshell, the various influences at the various stages in my life. And I'm grateful to all those people because without their guidance, without their friendship, I probably would not have taken the path less traveled that I have taken. So,
and thank you for sharing that with us, Ed, because they've given you the courage to be who you are and for taking unpopular stands for peace and justice all around the world. So thank you for that background. over to you, Olivia.
Good. Well, Ed, first of all, it's such a pleasure to meet you, having heard wonderful things from Kevin. So really looking forward to this conversation. Our conversation is mostly going to focus on the state of democracy, the current state of democracy in the Philippines. It would be wonderful to hear just a bit more of your life story. Among your other achievements, you started Lakasdiwa. I hope I'm pronouncing that somewhat correctly, which was the
first... Lakasdiwa, which means strength of spirit.
Lakasdiwa. Good. Which I believe was the first nonviolent movement against Marcos's dictatorship back in 1970. So what led you to take this initiative? And did you or any of your compatriots ever consider armed resistance before you started?
Well, let me start my story by saying, first of all, that I was an accidental activist. I was in the seminary at that time in the 1970s. And, I was in a meeting of young people after many of us were bloodied by truncheons during the State of the Nation address given by then dictator Marcos. And so we wanted to find out what kind of response could we make, especially then when a lot of young people were being radicalized and wanted to join the armed movement against Marcos. And so I was among those who did studies regarding the life of Mahatma Gandhi, Satyagraha, Ahimsa, commitment to truth, commitment to nonviolence. And so during that meeting, I was saying it's time perhaps to try civil disobedience, to be ready to go to jail for our beliefs. And not inflict suffering on others, but then to the capacity to shoulder the suffering ourselves. And so during that meeting, a lot of people, said the idea is very good. It provides an alternative, another option for young people's commitment. However, nobody wanted to lead it. And so I was kept holding the bag. I said, I'm not ready. And I am not so politically prepared. But then they said, well, you're the one. So I took on the leadership role in establishing Lakasdiwa. And that became, a very important nonviolent movement. Because of that, I was in jail first because we sang the national anthem in the Philippine Congress to stop their session because they were not responding to the demands of the people regarding the agrarian reform. And the other time, we were jailed because we had a sit-in at the office of the Secretary of Justice. And so, when they were picking up people to jail, I said, well, I'm one of the leaders of this group. I should join them. So I spent time in jail, but it was a very important experience for me because I befriended the chief jailer, and every night we used to play chess.
Oh, wonderful. And did the movement stay active right up until the People's Power Revolution?
This is a very interesting question. Actually, during the first quarter storm and during the martial law period, the Lakasdiwa was a very important element on the ground. However, during the period just prior to People's Power, we said that it was time for other movements to step up, like Justice for Aquino, Justice for All, Kaakbay. So many of us, joined other movements that were much more relevant during that period. leading to the People's Power experience in February of 1986. However, of course, there were some of our members who actually said to me, and he said, "What can nonviolence do?" And they were they were so impatient and said nothing will come out of it, and they joined the armed struggle. And so, as you can see, it was a very difficult time for young people who had ideals, for profound social change, but experienced, the nonviolent way as rather slow, painstaking, and it took time. And that's the reason why when the People's Power experience took place, and we went to the streets, what we call the Parliament of the Streets, and joined thousands and then later on millions of people on the streets, dividing the military camps, then obviously very few believe that such a peaceful gathering of committed, nonviolent people could bring about the downfall of a dictatorship. And as you know very well, the People's Power experience in the Philippines became a template for other experiences later on in parts of Asia, like in South Korea, even in Myanmar, and then Eastern Europe, and then the Arab Spring in the Middle East. And so, I believe that perhaps it was a gift to the world from our people, who also received a lot of solidarity from other peoples around the globe.
Can you explain a little bit about why you felt people power and ESDA and so forth were so crucial? What were the things that you did right in order to divide the military and bring the people with you?
Well, first of all, before I answer that question, I want to say what we did not do well.
Okay.
Our failure. I feel that we were not able to sustain, the energy, the vigilance of people to make them realize that this, in fact, is a marathon, that it will require almost a lifetime of struggle, a lifetime of commitment. And therefore, I feel that we were not able to harness the promise and the perils of people's power. So in a sense, that was our shortcoming, our failure. And that's why we are where we are right now. It was as if we were on a political treadmill. In the Philippines, we say, how is it possible that after all these years of struggle, we are still against a Marcos? This is something that for us really requires a lot of soul searching, and I will discuss that later. But regarding what we did well, first of all, I think it was important that we actually presented to the people an alternative. They were looking for alternatives, and a militant nonviolent approach was something that people did not imagine. So in other words, there was a deficit in political imagination, and I think we filled that gap. Secondly, I must say the importance of addressing the youth. The youth in our country, are very idealistic, and it was very important to harness their energies. Thirdly, it's to organize. The importance of organization. I remember reading at that time we read authors like Saul Alinsky, who was very important in social organizing. I think he was also used by Marshall Gantz at Harvard University, at the Kennedy School. And then also the works of Paulo Freire. I'm sure you're familiar with the word concienciación, which regarding the pedagogy of the oppressed. And finally, the different experiences of great people, which inspired us, like the life of Mahatma Gandhi, the life of Dom Helder Câmara in Recife in northern Brazil, the life of Martin Luther King, So there were many inspirations that allowed us to draw or stand on the shoulders of greatness, and therefore try our very best to be able to mount a nonviolent response to what was then a very powerful dictatorship that was supported by US military bases. You have to remember, the Philippines at the time was supported, by the US, particularly because there were military bases which were housing nuclear weapons. And that is the reason why, to just jump a little bit, when I became a member of the Constitutional Commission, I challenged my colleagues to say that we should not have military bases of another country that was desecrating our soil, our territory, especially because they were not willing to confirm or deny that there were nuclear weapons in our territory. And that's why I believe that in discussions, I recall with your former Prime Minister, David Longy, I went to New Zealand, or, was it Wellington?
Wellington, yeah.
Wellington, to find out how what advice he could give so that we can make a nuclear weapons-free country survive under the difficult international setting. And I think you're one of the pioneers also in creating a nuclear weapons-free region, in that part of the world, in our part of the world.
So speaking of the 1987 Constitution, you were, in fact, one of the framers. I imagine it must have been an exciting time. What was the atmosphere around the creation of the Constitution like? And did most of the country seem behind it? Was there wide popular support?
Well, first of all, let me speak about the popular support. During the plebiscite, regarding the people's voice, regarding their affirmation of the 1987 Philippine Constitution, it garnered 3/4 of the votes of people on the 2nd of February. This was in 1987. So, that I think is quite important. Secondly, I was the chair of the Public Hearings Committee of the Constitutional Commission. So I volunteered to go together with many other members of the commission. We were only 48. We traveled across the country, and I volunteered to go to the more difficult parts of the country, which was the north, because that was the bastion of Marcos. And I recall in Bantay, Ilocos Norte, when I spoke in the plaza to try to explain the Constitution, there was booing, and the booing went on for 5 minutes. And I just listened. And I said, now that the booing is dying down, I said, would you allow me to try to explain why the Constitution is also yours? And then I went to the military camps because the members of the military felt threatened by the Constitution because we had a strong Bill of Rights. And they said that the Constitution was against the military because of human rights. So I said to the Philippine Military Academy, around 1,000 young applicants for becoming officers in our armed forces, I said to them that this Constitution will protect your rights. So I went from military camp to another, and that was another experience. Then, of course, I went to Mindanao. Kevin is familiar with the island of Mindanao, where there was also armed struggle with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. And so, those were quite important experiences. And in the Constitution, I must say that we perhaps, on paper at least, we have one of the strongest Bill of Rights, because I recall consulting members of Amnesty International who sat in during some of the sessions to advise us on different aspects of the basic rights of people, including the abolition of the death penalty. I was one of the principal authors of that provision. And then in Article 13 of the Philippine Constitution, which is entitled Social Justice and Human Rights, we created a permanent commission on human rights, which later on was able to document and provide compensation to 101,000 victims of human rights. So that was important. And finally, to underscore the importance of consulting with people and their organizations regarding policy formulation and the implementation of policy, because it was a people-powered constitution. And finally, the separation of powers by the different branches of government, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, which unfortunately in today's setting, the president has, there is what we call a supermajority, both in the legislature and the judiciary. So the separation of powers is very blurred.
Thank you.
Gosh, I remember those heady times, Ed, as you were sort of framing the Constitution. It sort of seemed as though you were really thinking about a new Philippines for the 20th century. What do you think has been the arc of democracy in the Philippines since then, and what led to Rodrigo Duterte's populist appeal? You mentioned the abolition of capital punishment, but he unilaterally seemed to reinstate it for his anti-drug war. What was it like to live under Duterte's draconian administration, and what do you think of the short and long-term consequences of his rule?
Well, first of all, let me say this, Kevin. Perhaps I can summarize it in 2 words: failed expectations. We had political upheaval, we had political change, but perhaps what the Constitution and what successive governments failed to deliver was the expectations of those who lived in the margins of society. The twin challenges, which remain to this day the most important, is the politics of exclusion, and therefore poverty and inequality remain the foremost challenges as far as I can see. And because of that, because of the failed expectations, a lot of people were therefore looking for a kind of a messiah, a strongman. And Duterte, because even at the time, he was already one of those who wanted to misinform the people. He exaggerated the problems we face in the country. He exaggerated the problem of drugs, saying that 3 million Filipinos were drug addicts. In other words, he exaggerated problems in such a way that people were longing for a strong man, for someone who was very simplistic, and he would say, I would wipe out drug addiction in this country in the first 6 months of my administration. In fact, I must say that in the first 6 months of his administration, Duterte used the word kill for 1,254 times. This was documented by Rappler. That is why right now, after the killings of almost around 30,000 people in the drug war, then you have the International Criminal Court examining this phenomenon. In fact, there is a new book which came out, written by Patricia Evangelista of Rappler, which is entitled precisely A Memoir of Murder in My Country. And she documents all these killings. In fact, it was a war. The war on drugs was actually a war on the poor, because many of the killings happened in urban poor settlements. And the majority of those who were killed were actually either innocent or drug users, but they were not able to actually convict those who earned their millions because of the drug trade. So it was very difficult to live under the Duterte regime because he actually was supported by an army of trolls. Social media was used to the max. In other words, they were able to misinform. He was a serial liar, and a lot of hate and anger was part of his systematic campaign. In fact, when I think I showed you the book Courage, which I had written, and one of the chapters in the book actually speaks of the overcoming the politics of hate and fear, because as a strong man, what he wanted to underline was the importance of being afraid, that we the citizens were afraid, and that's why he was coming to save the country from all this, from what we were, from an exaggerated kind of narrative that things were so bad and the drugs were overwhelmingly apparent in many communities, which gave justification to his orders to the military and the police. He says, you can kill in my name because you are doing a service to our country. And of course, there were people who felt at ease with that, because then they became safe in the neighborhoods, in the enclaves of the rich in the country. And so, it divided us. So there was fear, there was anger, there was division. And so Duterte's reign was very difficult, and he closed the major TV and radio network, ABS-CBN, and he harassed Maria Ressa of Rappler, and obviously made it difficult for those who spoke out. I was in my 70s then, and I'm 80 right now, and I felt I spoke out because I felt I had nothing to lose, and so there were a few of us. In fact, a lot of people call me Lolo Edong, grandfather. I used to speak, and just even as late as the campaign, when Marcos Jr. campaigned, I also spoke out and I said why he is unfit to be president. And when he won, I spoke out in public and I said, we have a president who is a fraud. And then later on here, I will explain to you why I said that.
So it's often said that the golden rule can be paraphrased as he who has the gold makes the rules. What role does wealth and class play in Philippine politics? Has there ever been any serious effort to deal with economic inequality and poverty, which you've described as being so strong? And if not, what do you think this means for the future of Philippine democracy?
I'm very glad you asked that question, because obviously that is central to the dilemmas we face regarding our democracy. But first, on the lighter side, let me say this. I laughed when I saw that question initially, because one of the promises of the Marcoses during the campaign was that they had enough gold, because according to them, they found the treasures of Yamashita, the Japanese commander in the northern part of the country. And so they had enough gold, and they called it the Italiano gold, that they could distribute to people after he won. Obviously, right now, the question in the minds and lips of many people is, where is that gold? And that's why I said whoever thought of that question is brilliant, because gold was a major campaign issue in the country. But going very seriously now to the heart of the question, you see, my experience in the Philippines is precisely this. the advent of of parliamentary democracy does not automatically mean political democracy. That's the first thing I learned. Secondly, if democracy's logic is the rule of the majority, then it cannot live side by side where an economy is ranged against the majority who are poor. In other words, if the logic of the majority in a democracy is the rule of the majority, then you cannot at the same time exclude the majority from economic wealth and opportunity. And then the third dilemma which we faced was, how can the guardians of the old order preside in the transition towards the new? In Latin, there is a phrase, quis custodiet custodios. In other words, who will guard the guards? And therefore, these were the kind of dilemmas that we faced. The military and the police, they are given a lot of rewards, a lot of fringe benefits. But the majority of the people who do not have medical care, who do not have access to schools, who do not have livelihood opportunities, who are not given social security, they live on the margins of society, and therefore they cannot participate in the democratic process in any meaningful way. And
Right.
a lot of politicians perpetuate this. That's why in the Philippines we call them political dynasties, who also have private armies. We have in different regions of the country families who dominate for a long time. And that's why the Marcoses are still strong in the north, because they have perpetuated the politics of personalities and patronage. In the Eastern Visayas, the family of the Romualdeses, or the Imelda Romualdez Marcos family, is very strong, and so on. In other words, in different parts of the country, you have families who have dominated for a long time. In the Senate, we have a brother and sister tandem. We have a mother and son tandem. You know, we have a lot of interlocking relationships who are, in political office. And it's very difficult to dislodge them,
Right.
and their interests. And we actually prohibit political dynasties in our constitution. But the problem is there is no enabling act. In other words, you have a
Right.
provision in the constitution, but you have to have an enabling act to make it happen. But the members of Congress, because their political futures are threatened by this provision, they refuse to implement it. And so we're caught in a bind. And that is why the reason, the twin challenges of poverty and inequality remains. There is a lot of understanding of the major challenges, and there has been good plans, but then the leadership is unable to implement the plans. And obviously, the people who get disenchanted with the slow process that democratic institutions normally run on, then they turn to those who provide us with what is known here as false nostalgia. The nostalgia of people who claim to have done good deeds in the past, which is not true. And I think this is one of the reasons, because from Duterte you have Marcos Jr.
Since President Marcos's use of the military to impose martial law in the 70s, have recent administrations been able to maintain civilian control over the military? And what do you see as the role of the military in the political future of the Philippines? And in line with what you were talking about a little earlier, how do you and others feel about the reintegration of the US military into the Philippines' life?
All right. Those are two huge questions. The first one regarding the military, sometimes you can really co-opt, the leadership and of the military and the police of the intelligence, precisely by providing them with so much fringe benefits that the other sectors of society do not enjoy. So at the time of Cory Aquino, I recall, we actually founded a movement called Kilos, because there were 7 coup attempts during her first years in office. I was one of the founders of Kilos, because in the Philippines at that time, military coup attempts were publicly announced and publicly postponed. There were those of us who believed that we had to confront it, and we said on the air, on television and radio at that time, before the military would take over, we said, if you attempt this, then the students will not study, the teachers will not teach, the bakers will not bake, the drivers will not drive. In other words, we will make sure that we are at a standstill. So don't try another coup attempt. So this was a method that we used following the playbook on civil disobedience. But then, lately there's another approach which the Duterte and Marcos governments are taking, which is to co-opt the military leadership by providing them with perks. In fact, many of our government leadership positions are occupied by former military generals. So it's like they give the present and former members of the military a lot of privileges, of advantages not enjoyed by the rest of the population. So there's another way of co-opting them into the system. And regarding the second question, this is a question that needs to be dealt with, in a very serious manner, because during the drafting of the Philippine Constitution, we said that military bases of a foreign country, specifically the US military bases, cannot be allowed in our soil because it is an intrusion on our sovereignty, especially because there was no treaty. So he said, if we're going to have a foreign military base, there must be a formal treaty signed by both countries. And then secondly, we said, and this was the reason why we were able to kind of deal with the question, he said, we cannot allow nuclear weapons in our territory. And that won the day. In other words, that was included in the provision in our Constitution that there cannot be nuclear weapons in our territory. And that's why the US, which for its policy neither confirms nor denies it, then they were unable to come to grips with that question. And then finally, when there was no treaty that was forthcoming, the US military bases, thanks to the eruption of Mount Pinatubo, the volcano, they had to leave because their aircraft in Clark Airfield, could not function because of the volcanic ash. And so they actually left in 1991, thanks to the volcanic eruption, the force majeure. But because of the situation in the West Philippine Sea, China and its incursions into the different man-made islands that they have now kind of fortified, made into fortresses. Because of that, there is obviously a fear on the part of Philippines, because some of our leaders are very close to China. I will come to that a little later, because they were part of the trolls and part of the financing for presidential runs came from China. Then there is fear that you had to rely on the military strength of the US to prevent a Chinese walkover. And so it is very difficult to argue against US military presence at this time, precisely because of the Chinese conundrum. So, although there has been a arbitral ruling providing the safety and our territory, especially around the seas, it is internationally recognized, but it is violated by the major powers. And so right now, the reliance on the US to protect ourselves from China, it is very difficult to argue publicly because a lot of people are saying, but we need the umbrella of their military strength to be able to deter the Chinese from taking over.
So I think you've already touched on it, Ed, but tell us a little more how you would explain Marcos Jr.'s landslide victory just 36 years after his father was ousted from his dictatorship by a people's movement.
First of all, let me say this, it is corroborated that the Marcoses, early on, around 2015 or 16, just before he lost the vice presidential race, he already was preparing for the presidential race. And what did he do? First, number one, to consult Cambridge Analytica and its parent company, because, Cambridge Analytica, people are finding out more and more, was involved not only in Brexit, it was also involved in Donald Trump's campaign. And here in the Philippines, Cambridge Analytica was asked by the Marcoses to rebrand the Marcos name. So when he ran for president, he was rebranded as BBM. Secondly, he actually had what is known as an army of trolls. And the trolls, many of them, they found out, were fictitious accounts in Facebook that had their origins either in China or Russia. And then there is an account, a Rappler study, which actually says that they in fact had their funding from the communications office of the office of the president, so that these troll farms would misinform, would maliciously try to malign the opponent. At that time, it was Leni Robredo. And so, the vicious attacks, especially because she was a woman candidate, and because of the lies repeated over time, and the attempt to revise history, a lot of people who were born after the martial law period obviously, did not understand perfectly what was going on. So there was a lot of revisionism and a lot of, as I said, false nostalgia for a past that never really happened.
Right.
And therefore, it was very important to seduce in political terms an electorate, many of whom were content to receive money in exchange for their votes because they were so poor. And then secondly or thirdly, because in the provinces, we had a patronage politics system wherein people who were looking for some improvement in their lives were being fed through their social media accounts, so Facebook, YouTube, an entire ecosystem of lies, of anger and hate. So, and Marcos obviously posed as the candidate of unity, he said it's time to move on. But then how can you move on when you have not dealt, with the past? And so, these were the factors which, in a sense, allowed Marcos Jr. to return with a vengeance, with huge margins that was actually known 2 hours after the polls closed, which never happens in the Philippines. In other words, there's an entire investigation going on led by citizens, especially those who are IT experts. How is it possible that such an outcome can be known in a country, and we are famous for our slow internet, and yet getting the results in, it was consistent. The like 60, 30, 10. So normally, when you have elections, the votes, when they come in from different parts of the country, they go up and down. Here, there was a uniform spread. And so there are lots of questions. Putting that aside, I can understand, while the failed expectations of people and their desire for instant political gratification or vindication led them to make a choice, especially because they also controlled, in many ways, different political dynasties in the country. But what I must say is the kind of campaign waged by the losing candidate, Vice President Leni Robredo, who was my student in sophomore at the University of the Philippines. She led a campaign that was based on voluntarism, on the enthusiasm of the youth, and her rallies in all parts of the country. There was such tremendous support. This is one of the areas of promise, areas of possible, harnessing the energies of the youth and many volunteer groups in the country to be able to rebuild a democracy that is destroyed and broken. Regarding the state-sponsored troll farms, there are 375 contract workers who were paid $1.4 million to be able to work, to destroy, day in and day out. They would put lies laced with anger and hate against the woman candidate, and this it definitely made life difficult for those who opposed the Marcos juggernaut. It was really he was never involved in any single debate.
Oh my!
Not a single time was he. Did he ever give a press conference during the campaign, because he was so sure that the best way to win this was to keep quiet and let the trolls do the action.
And sadly, that was true.
Yeah, and it's very chilling, actually, Ed, that trolls can have that much influence. That leads on to the next question, some of which you've already answered in a way, but your Center for Media Freedom and Responsibility identify 5 similarities between the Marcos regime of the 70s and the current Marcos regime. And they mention distribution of propaganda through government agencies, the ABS, CBN shutdown, threats against journalists, crony press, and media selectivity in propaganda films, which mean that there are some very chilling similarities between the two administrations, despite Bongbong's promise that he wouldn't declare martial law. I mean, what do you think is the state of the freedom of the press and the capacity of other media in the Philippines to resist the sort of trolling that you've been talking about? And do you believe Bongbong when he says that he wouldn't declare martial law?
What we actually have in this country is already a martial law in disguise. Because, first of all, there is a chilling effect. There are many journalists and environmentalists, defenders of our land, and defenders of the truth, who are threatened. So people have been killed, especially in the provinces. And those who write obviously write at times with fear in their hearts because they don't know what's going to happen or what's going to happen next. And therefore, the state of media freedom in the country is that many writers practice self-censorship. In other words, you are very careful about what you say and how you say it because you can be charged with cyber libel and so on, which is what happened to Maria Ressa, this is and especially we have a law, we have an anti-terror law which allows the executive and a committee to be able to determine whether in fact you are crossing the line, and therefore you are liable to be named what they call in the Philippines red tagging. You can be tagged as a sympathizer or as a member of the Communist Party, and therefore you feel threatened. Without ABS-CBN, there is no single credible TV station that is able to operate, completely with complete the freedom that one would wish. The same thing with the major dailies, and Rappler, precisely because Maria Ressa with her team of young people are still able to operate, but also again under much pressure. And thanks to her Nobel Peace Prize designation, the award given her, she has some kind of protective shield. But again, that doesn't hold true for many others who do not have that same reputation. So it's not easy. But then some of us, feel that we have to put it on the air. So I recall, I went on a series of YouTube presentations. I call it Conversations with Lolo Edong. I said, during the campaign, Marcos is unfit to be president. And now that he's president, he's a fraud for 3 reasons. Number 1, he was complicit in plunder. You see, the $10 billion which the Marcoses stole, he is complicit in hiding that because the U.S. federal court, the Swiss courts, and the Philippine courts, they have all declared that there are actually funds that have been identified, but which he as heir, one of the heirs of the family's fortunes, are unwilling to surrender. So in other words, he benefits from the spoils of the plunder. So I would say, number 1, he is complicit in plunder. Number 2, he is also complicit in the atrocities, in the human rights atrocities that took place in the time of Marcos, because he refuses to acknowledge, to make a public apology or restitution for the victims of martial law. And we had, as I said to you, identified 101,000 victims of martial law, 70,000 of whom were arbitrarily arrested. There were 35,000 of those, or nearly a half, were tortured. And then there were 3,000 who were killed. In the Philippines, the word that's used is salvaged. And then finally, there were those who were outrightly disappeared, around 2,000. Up to now, the word desaparecido has become part of our vocabulary. And so the human rights, the human rights kind of situation remains, in this state, because there has been no acknowledgement from the perpetrators of these crimes. In fact, we say, many of us in the country say, you know, how can you have a president who is the thief in chief, because he actually doesn't pay his, you know, the estate taxes, which amounts to a huge amount. And then thirdly, he campaigned on the theme of unification, to unify the country to move on. And yet, what this government has done is to divide our people. We are deeply divided. And then we say, how can you have a president who can unify the country when in fact he's the divider in chief? You know, he divides. You know, and so I think this is happening in many countries. You know, in the U.S., 35% of the population, no matter what happens, you know, is still, you know, with Trump. You know, it's incredible. For me, my main observation is that what is worse, Trump or the fact that 35% of the population in the U.S. believe in Trump? You know,
it's a good question.
and he denies the outcome of the 2020 of the elections. No? And so, you know, I guess, Kevin, I'm sure you are beginning to think, how can the results in the New Zealand election, you know, kind of mirror or portray some of these frustrations? Just because you run an airline company doesn't mean you can run a country.
That's true.
The best way possible for the good of the people. Maybe you can do good for a few passengers or in the first class cabins of the airlines that you run. But how can you ensure that those on the ground who never fly are going to receive the benefits? So I'm sure the New Zealanders must be thinking, where are we going?
They are.
Are we flying? And so, as I said, you know, that's why what's happening in the Philippines is, in a sense, you know, a microcosm of what can happen in Eastern Europe, what can happen in parts of Latin America, and so on. You know, and we must examine also the kinds of influences like social media, like the politics of hate and fear, and all those the inability of our youth to find meaningful participation, so that they commit. And this is really, you know, a challenge which, you know, in my, you know, as I said, this is my last hurrah. You know, once you reach 80 and you want to, you know, make a distinct contribution. So I follow the injunction of your father. What are the three things that remain? In the end, what is important is love, courage, and hope.
Yeah.
So picking up on the theme of hope, Ed, what democratic structures or democratic institutions still remain resilient in the Philippines, despite all the erosion that you've described? What aspects of Philippines democracy can still be built upon in a constructive way?
First of all, I believe in our young people. Our young people are capable of great things, and they can stand on the shoulders of those who have struggled in the past. That's the first thing I want to say. Secondly, we have good mentors, good teachers in different parts of the country, and the teachers are very valuable mentors. They can be in different fields, in the field of academics, math and sciences, in sports, and so on. Number three, we have a fairly progressive church leadership. Archbishop Pablo Virgilio David, you know, is a very vocal and courageous prophet. And we have a number of good bishops and priests and pastors and imams in the south in Mindanao, who, like, for example, also Archbishop Tony Ledesma, who works with the Bishops Ulama Conference. So we have religious leadership who are able to speak truth to power. And then women, the Filipino women are known for their consistently courageous speaking. And in fact, the Philippines does not have very sterling performance in the field of sports, but it's our women athletes who have led the way. And so we say to the rest of the population, listen to the women. So Leni Robredo remains a beacon of hope. The lone opposition senator in the Philippines is another former student of mine, Risa Hontiveros. Hontiveros, she was my student at the Jesuit University, Ateneo de Manila, and she is very courageous woman, and she is an outspoken. And then, of course, you have Leila de Lima, who was a former chair of the Human Rights Commission, and she is now 6 years in jail. There is a book that is entitled 6 Women for Justice, which is edited by Asuncion Maramba, and I am one of the writers. I write the life of Leni Robredo. There are 6 women, Leila de Lima, Risa Hontiveros, Maria Ressa, and so on, who have spent lives fighting for social justice. And these are beacons of hope. In other words, the Philippines is not wanting for examples, for sources of inspiration. And I believe that this is a bright spot in our country, because even if we are barely trying to survive, our noses above water, we still have a reservoir of hope that we can count on. And that's why I say the task for the moment is to keep hope alive. That is in a sense the legacy of those of us who are involved in the last hurrah, that we just have to keep hope alive, because others will necessarily come up and be able to step up, to be able to stand up, and to be able to rebuild from the brokenness that we have in this world. And then finally, I want to just mention, and that is why in the case of Israel and Palestine, the reason why it is so important to realize that a lot of young people around the globe are saying, for God's sake, stop the bombing. For God's sake, there must be a humanitarian pause, a humanitarian ceasefire. And then at the same time, if you want a safe and secure future for all, on both sides of the divide, you have to have a negotiated political settlement solution at the end, because this will never end. This will be a cycle unending unless we are able to look far forward and build a society side by side who live peacefully while respecting all the rights and the lives of peaceful civilians in their areas.
Ed, I think we should end there. I should say, Lola, Ed, I think we should end here, because you've once again demonstrated that even in your 80s, you've saged well, and more importantly, you've maintained the fire in your belly to make sure that wherever there's injustice, you will be working for justice. Wherever there's unpeacefulness, you'll be working for peace. And wherever there is political dictatorship, you'll be looking for democratic support. I just want to thank you on behalf of the Toda Peace Institute and Olivia for a wonderful tour de force, and for giving us hope and strength to carry on the kind of work that you've been doing, not only in the Philippines, but all around the world. And thank you for your faith, for your belief, and for your love and concern for everyone.